Good afternoon. Good to see you all. My name is Beena Khimani, and I am here to talk to you about how you can simplify your cost estimation and forecasting. I am here with Keith Jarrett. He leads our go-to-market operations, and he will dive into details of all the tools that can help you with this optimization and forecasting. And we are here with our valued customer, Intuit. Jason is from Intuit. And Intuit has really done a fantastic job mastering how to plan, forecast, and really budget their spend and optimize how they are making these investments. And Jason is going to share the journey on what they are doing, what tools, what business processes, what cultural aspects they are working with that help them get to a really good state. So with that, we'll get started. Thank you, Keith and Jason. All right. So whether you are from finance, you are from IT, you are from business development, you are from building applications, you're a builder, you are the budget owner or the delivery manager who is worried about the cost or owns the budget. Regardless of your role, I strongly believe that you will find this session useful because we are going to talk about not just how to build most optimally on AWS, but really how do you think about cost governance? How do you think about establishing the baseline, planning your spend, and then really making sure that you are comfortable letting your builders build without worrying about the cost because you have established the right processes and automated the governance so that you are comfortable letting your builders build that whenever they are building, they are provisioning new services, they are really going to not impact something that gives you some kind of billing shock. So that is the whole process. And whenever any of you are thinking about bringing your new workloads to AWS, or you are thinking about building a new application on AWS, or building some line of business on AWS, a lot of times the type of things that you would think about is that how do I really effectively plan my spend? What is it going to really cost me? Is it really cost efficient for me to run this certain workload on-prem or on AWS? On AWS also, how do I make certain kind of commitments like savings plan purchases or reserve instances so that I am planning where I have maximum savings? Have you thought about there are so much fluctuations in my business? There are certain peak times and there are certain off-peak times. And how do I really forecast so that I can purchase the right level of savings plan, or I am planning my budget and purchasing the right level of services so that there is no performance degradation because of lack of resources. At the same time, I'm optimizing my savings and I'm planning and budgeting for the right spend. Many times, customers think about, I am bringing this brand new application from on-prem to AWS. What is going to be the total cost of ownership on AWS? How do I build the business case so that I can convince my leaders that when we bring it to AWS, this is how much savings we will see? Not only how do I build the business case and understand the total cost of ownership, but I also think about that how do I continue to validate the business case? That we started the migration, Now we are running 2 parallel environments. Now we are phasing out this environment. Are we really seeing the savings that we planned for? So those are the type of questions that our customers think about when they think about planning and forecasting. So one thing to think about, planning, forecasting, evaluating, this is a continuous cycle. It is not something that you do it one time and you are done. So think about this, that as you are bringing new workload, there are two things going on. One thing is that you are trying to figure out that, or you are building a new application on AWS, you are thinking about what kind of services do I need? How much is it going to cost me? You are trying to understand the behavior of your own applications and projects and understand how different fluctuations, how much workload, how many EC2 instances, what type of S3 services, what Lambda, this, that, what kind of different services utilization do you anticipate, and how much it will cost you, what kind of usage, and what kind of discounts, and what kind of commitments, and you are trying to figure this out. At the same time, when you are forecasting this, you are trying to do some kind of analysis that what if I am, in addition to this organic growth, I am also planning to build this new application. How will that turn out? So as you are going through this, you come up with a forecast. And once through this iterative process, your forecast is something that you are settled on, that yes, this is exactly what I believe where we are likely to land with this certain margin. Now that forecast becomes the budget. This is the budget that you are setting for specific workloads, specific environments, specific projects. And now you make those purchases, and now you are trying to make sure that you are really following and meeting this budget or not. You are evaluating that we believe that this is the level of usage for this particular application, environment, anything. And are the builders building within that budget, or are they breaking the budget? Are there any unanticipated runaway workloads, some kind of long-running database query, or somebody deployed an EMR cluster that nobody has put any application on over the weekend, and that's consuming your resources? So there might be many unanticipated or unintended spend that might cause you to break budget. Or there might be builders just building, and you didn't think about certain situations that can cause you to break the budget. So now the third phase is that you are continuously evaluating that whatever we budgeted, are we really meeting the budget? Are we close to it? Are we way below, way above? And how are we going to plan around it? So planning for whatever workloads that you need to handle on AWS, and then forecasting and creating the budget, and then evaluating that you are really meeting the budget or not. These are the type of business processes we are going to talk about today. So where we are really headed is, first of all, cloud cost governance starts with baselining. If you do not know, what to anticipate, you don't know what is the expected baseline, then you don't know what budget to set. You might have really good tools, but you don't know where to set the threshold. For a specific application, project, environment, you don't know what is the threshold I should be setting that, if it is close to 80% of that utilization, then I should get the alert, or I should take automated action. But where to set the threshold, for that also you need to understand the baseline of all these applications and environments. Then once you understand the baseline, you really need, none of the applications you are handling are going to be static. they will have their own peaks and valleys. They will have, there will be new applications, there will be new additions to environments, there will be organic and inorganic growths. Some of you might be even acquiring some company and bringing them over to AWS. So there will be many variations. So how do you really forecast the dynamic usage and the changes related to that? And what are the mechanisms and tools that we can use for monitoring and evaluating this? So those are some of the things that we'll dive into detail. And Intuit has put it all together with help of the right business processes, tools, and evaluation mechanisms that we'll dive into deep into to understand how Intuit is doing all of this together. So let's jump right in. When we speak about planning, it's really, thinking about how do we optimize your cloud operations. Anybody who brings workload to AWS or are building new workload on AWS, this is the exit phase that, there is so much focus on how do I bring it to AWS and make it work. And sometimes there is lost sight on to how do I really optimize my cloud operations and financial operations so that we can get best return on the investment. We can get the most value out of the cloud. But as we see this, right, that there is tremendous value. We surveyed, Forrester surveyed 1,500 or so customers, and they, received the information that 241% return on investment over 3 years. That's very, very promising. But this all starts with establishing the right guardrails, right baseline, and right mechanisms in place so that you can automate this entire cloud governance. It also brings 62% more productivity, 57% decrease in downtime. So overall, the performance, the productivity, the cost savings, all of these are very promising. But to get there, we need to have a discipline in establishing the right cost guardrails. Now, when we are planning for AWS for different type of workload, the tools and processes are slightly different. If you have decided to shut down a data center and bring all your applications and servers to AWS, it's slightly different than you are building cloud-native applications. Now, when you are talking about migrating applications or workloads, there is an entire phase of data gathering. You are thinking about what are the legacy applications that I want to leave it here, and what are the applications, out of your entire stack of applications. What are the applications that I want to lift and shift? What are the few applications that I want to modernize and bring it to cloud-native services as I am bringing it to AWS? So as you are doing this kind of planning and you are kind of doing this analysis, you are collecting all types of data that help you get there. Now you are creating not only the technical models that, hey, how I'm going to migrate certain applications, what are the technical dependencies, doing the impact analysis that if I migrate this application, what are the other things that I have to migrate to make it work. You are going through a lot of architectural choices that how my landing zone is going to look like, what is that blueprint for my landing zone so that every time I bring the application, it gets certain things by default. So you're thinking about this cloud architecture. This is the exit time. You should also think about financial and cost and operational planning. So it's really, really important to think about as you are bringing certain applications, you are going to deploy it. Maybe you are using AWS Control Tower. At that time, what are the usage estimation you have? What is the phase of migration? What is the business case for migration for certain applications? Over what period of time you will see what type of return on investment when you bring these applications to AWS? what is the total cost of ownership? So all types of analysis, and then again thinking about as you deploy these applications or migrate these applications to cloud, are you putting the right, are you configuring AWS budgets? Are you putting the right cost guardrails in place? Are you thinking about automatically, configuring cost anomaly detection? So if there are runaway workloads, then you have it automatically deployed as a part of the landing zone. So what are the cost control guardrails you are laying out? This is the time to think about that. At the same time, overall, you want to compare overall cost that you will have for specific application or environment as you bring to AWS, and you want to compare it with either you are bringing from other cloud providers or on-prem, how the cost is going to look like. Many of you might be familiar with Migration Evaluator. So when you are planning for bringing the new workload, Migration Evaluator is a great place to start. This is primarily focused on really helping you make the decision. And this is even before you, make certain purchases of AWS services, that what is it that, I want to bring over? You want to discover all your applications. It is very, very common that many customers do not really have good inventory of all their applications. Many customers are still trying to figure out, there might be a lot of legacy code and people might have moved in and out of the organization. They're trying to figure out exactly, if I move this, what else is going to break? So those kind of impact analysis. So there are just a lot of things you want to do. So you want to really discover your inventory. You want to determine the most cost-effective path to bring your cloud workload to the cloud. You want to not only think about infrastructure spend savings, that, hey, this is the service that if I use, or these are the applications, this is how much it will cost me, and this is the best path. But also you are thinking about, hey, I have made this purchase of Microsoft SQL Server licenses, or Windows licenses, or .NET licenses, and some of them are on-prem, some of them I can bring it over. Or do I want license included versus BYOL? Bring your own license. So those kind of analysis you are trying to do, that, hey, how is the license cost impact for Microsoft workload when I'm making this decision to bring over certain application? So again, Migration Evaluator will help you get there. So a lot of powerful tools here. It provides you the quick insight. It gives you the directional business case. This is very powerful, especially if you are trying to explain your own leadership on why certain workloads should move to AWS versus, certain things you might want to leave on-prem. So it helps you build that business case. It gives you visibility into the overall total cost of ownership for running that particular application on AWS. Now, this is, if you are bringing the new workload from on-prem to AWS or other cloud to AWS, but what if you are building a brand new application on AWS? So you are trying to figure out that, hey, I want to build this application that's going to require X, Y, and Z services. How much it will cost me? Different services have different units. They have different price points, and based on certain level of usage, it will cost you differently. So pricing calculator is another tool that supports over 150 AWS services, and it has a really good mechanism like group by feature, where you can club certain services together and see the overall cost. You can see it by region. You can slice and dice in many ways. Even if you are existing customer with almost most your applications here, and you are trying to relaunch some brand new service, and you are, say, AWS Billing Conductor or some of these services, and you are trying to figure out that, based on my own workload and my own consumption, if I start using this new service or set of services, how much it will cost me. So AWS pricing calculator will help you plan your spend based on that. With that, we are going to jump into forecasting, and this is where getting accuracy in the forecasting is really the essence of planning. I'm going to hand over to Keith to take it from here. Thank you. Thank you, Keith.
Okay, thank you, Beena. So we talked a little bit about how we're going to establish our baseline costs, and establish our plan and our business case with things like our pricing calculator, migration evaluator. I want to quickly switch gears and talk about how we're going to better forecast in this dynamic variable cost world, because it can be a trick, right? Prediction can be hard, right? Especially if it's about the future, right? And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's a lot of adages or sayings out there about forecasting, right? Like, forecasts are always wrong. How many people have heard that saying, right? Grew up with that one, right? So there's a kernel of truth with all those sayings. You know, they may be right, they may be wrong, but there's a kernel of truth, right? And while all forecasts are wrong, some forecasts are particularly useful, right? They're useful because they help us identify where the risks are to our business and to our plan, right? Where the opportunities are, maybe where we need to adjust our operations and our planning, right? And ultimately, where we may need to adjust our financial plans, our budgets. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. But before we get into actual forecasting, right, it's critical that we understand, where we are today, right? So building off of what Beena was talking about, it's essential for us to get a view into what our costs and usage are today. And tagging is a really critical piece to doing this well, right? By employing a consistent tagging strategy across our business, we can get a better view into what those costs are by cost center or business unit, by application, by owner, right? It can help us create those chargeback and cost allocation reports. It's a critical piece, right? And in addition to having that consistent tagging strategy, it really helps make sure we have a consistent account management strategy that goes along with that, right? So AWS accounts aren't technically hierarchical, right? But customers are using AWS organizations to create that logical grouping that can help make sense for your operations and your billing processes, right? So when we talk about those logical groupings or those organizational units or OUs, right, we see customers doing this in a way that really helps them start to make sense of their costs and usage, right? Not just mirroring how they're organized as a company, but thinking about identifying groups of individuals who should have consistent permissions, right? Or thinking about how we're going to kind of group things in a way that maps back to our operations. So typically that means one of three things, right? One is environmental lifecycle account management structure, where you're aligning your operations and your billing to be consistent with your application lifecycle deployment. Two is product management or project management account management structures, where you're, again, trying to operationalize and align your billing with either products or projects or programs. And then foundational groupings, which could be things like security and compliance or shared infrastructure. But getting those things in place helps us when it comes time to make sure that we're not only monitoring how we're doing against our plan, but making sure that we're adhering to that plan as an organization. And when it comes to forecasting, we typically refer to two different methodologies. I'm going to talk just briefly about that here, right? We think about forecasting in two different ways, and oftentimes I think there's a lot of confusion around forecasting and what we mean by forecasting, because I think sometimes we try and shove everything into one type of methodology, and it's just not fair, right? It's helpful to kind of bifurcate this and talk about which each of these individual components are. The first is trend-based, and the second is driver-based forecasting. Trend-based is a good way for us to take a look at our existing workloads and what type of organic growth we can expect over time by looking at how our user base is growing and how that may impact demand for compute, storage, and networking resources, right? But no matter how much we analyze that historical data or how much we deploy machine learning on that data, right? No amount of machine learning is going to tell us when we're going to launch our next application, right? Or when we're planning for that next migration, or when we're going to acquire that company. And so for those types of business drivers, we need to couple that trend-based forecast with an understanding of what are companies planning to do and what type of resources they're planning to use before they actually do it. So before we talk about how we kind of marry those practices, because it is important to think about those types of methodologies as not just an either-or conversation, but an and, how we bring those two together in a unified way. But before we do that, it's important, I think, for us to talk a little bit of taxonomy and lexicon, right? And how we kind of refer to all the various factors and variables that are going to impact your forecast, right? Because there's a lot of idiosyncrasies that can impact your specific numbers, and that's going to be different for your company and your company, right? Everyone's going to have a slightly different situation. So for us, we tend to bucket all those factors into 4 categories. The first we've talked about a little bit already, which is organic growth. Again, that's the type of growth of IT consumption that we can expect from just expanding our user base associated with our applications, right? As we continue to launch new features and new code, right, we expect our applications to continue to grow, and that's what we mean by organic growth. Second, we have what we call internal drivers, and our IT and product teams here are responsible for a lot of these drivers, right? Whether they're going to launch that new application, right, new environments, new migrations, right, M&A activity, and then external drivers. External drivers could mean any sort of end user growth above and beyond what we'd expect from organic growth. So this could include sales and marketing campaigns, right? Free promotions, free trial promotions. Could include seasonality and how that impacts our business. But again, is growth driven by end users above and beyond what we would expect with our organic growth. And while these first 3 drivers we can kind of associate with growth of our IT consumption, right? Optimization is our opportunity to become more cost efficient and drive our costs down, even while that usage may be increasing, right? So doing things like right sizing, using savings plan, platform commitments, right? Identifying idle resources, all that good stuff, right? Making sure that we're stretching our dollars as far as possible, even while our usage may be growing. So in practice, right, this is what we can visually expect, right? Where we start kind of stacking up these drivers on top of each other, right? So for an example, in purple, we have our trend-based forecast, which shows this kind of organic growth increasing throughout the year. In yellow and red, we see product-based demand drivers above and beyond that, right? So again, in this type of environment or this type of visualization, as a product team, not only are we able to see kind of what our run rate should be for the year or month-over-month cost expectations, but allows us to break that down also by demand driver and by product, right? So we can start to make those adjustments, really kind of know where the sensitivity is in our forecast, all right, and either mitigate some of those risks or replan as needed. So when it comes to forecasting, it comes to trend-based forecasting, right? AWS provides 2 great services here, both machine learning based. All right, the first is forecasting with Cost Explorer. So Cost Explorer is a powerful tool right out of the box, accessible from the cost management console. And in addition to just kind of reporting and visualization capabilities, it allows us to take 12 months of historical data and project 12 months into the future with an 80% confidence interval. So that can be really helpful for business users, product owners, FinOps practitioners, right? Operations teams, virtually like anybody within your company, right? That can be a very helpful thing, particularly out of the box. There's no setup required. Once you have enabled Cost Explorer, those forecasts become available. All right, a couple things to consider, however. Right, today, the forecast is limited to 12 months. Right, so if you need to forecast beyond that, we need to have to explore some other options. Right, confidence interval is 80%. There's no customization there. And the other potential hang-up here is we'll provide those 80% forecasts as long as there's enough data. So for one example here that kind of comes up somewhat frequently is if you have a new account that hasn't undergone a full billing cycle, that forecast won't be available, but will be available soon thereafter. Right? But again, out of the box, really powerful tool. The second is AWS Forecast. An AWS Forecast is a customizable machine learning based forecast that allows you to train models and take advantage of up to a dozen different algorithms to set your forecast quickly, right? And where we talked about with Cost Explorer, maybe something that could be applicable to really any user within your organization, right? Forecast is a little bit more ideal for those data scientists or analysts, for engineers and sometimes operations teams, but it does give you a lot more customization potential, right? You can extend your forecast beyond 12 months. One of the really compelling things here is also coupling or marrying your AWS data with other auxiliary data that you may have, right? That could be like weather data or you name it. So you could start understanding what other variables outside of your cost and usage report are going to be driving your forecast. So lots of customization and flexibility here. Some things to consider though, right? Which is there is a little bit more setup time required, right? It does take some statistical or infrastructure baseline knowledge to get up and running, right? We have to do some training of those models and potential maintenance of retraining those models, but again, it can be a very powerful tool. The one other thing I'll call out with forecasts, right, is not only getting an accurate forecast is important to our company, right? When it comes to having useful forecasts, one of the things we hear often is that forecast explainability is critical as well, right? Which is an understanding of like what those variables are that are driving the sensitivity of the model, like understanding how things are calculated, right? And using those things to be able to adjust, right? And with AWS forecast explainability, we get those types of insights that kind of highlight where maybe price or weather or holiday data may be the kind of key drivers to some of that variability. Okay, so we talked a little bit about forecasting for organic growth, right? Let's talk a little bit about non-organic growth, right? Those things that may be masked by when we limit ourselves just to kind of historic cost and usage data, right? Because this type of process, right, it's just that, it's a process, right? I think when we think about forecasting, right, I want to encourage us to think about this as not just a service-based solution, right? We got to tackle it from an organization, from a people, process, and technology perspective. And a lot of this process starts by looking at what metrics are going to impact our business. And we've seen a lot of customers successful using a unit metric approach to start that type of non-organic growth forecast. A unit metric is any quantifiable base level item that is impactful for your business, right? This could be API calls, users or subscribers. It could be resource level, right? Number of instances you're running, or average gigabytes or petabytes, exabytes, right? But what's important is that we look at what is most impactful to our applications and our business. And once we've identified what those units are, is understanding what those units are going to cost us. What is the cost to deliver, on average, those instances or those gigabytes or support those users, right? And once we've been able to do that, then comes the process of starting to collaboratively work across departments and teams. Finance and procurement, all right, sales and marketing, our product and engineering teams, so that we're not just figuring out what the cost is, but anticipating what is coming up, right? What our pipeline looks that will affect these type of unit metrics over the course of the next month, quarter, and year. And so once we've kind of gone through planning and forecasting, we come to our last phase of our planning cycle, which is evaluate, right? Which is a step in the process where we kind of step back and evaluate how we've done with our forecasts and our plans, where the variance is, where we need to make adjustments, and build that into our next planning cycle. And at its core, there's two key components here. It's making sure that we're identifying our key metrics and indicators, and it's making sure we're using the right cost management tools, not only to monitor and track our progress, but also, as Bina mentioned, is establishing the right guardrails to make sure that we're adhering as closely to those plans as possible. So, similar to our conversation with unit metrics, right? There is no end of the list of potential metrics that you can use to kind of monitor and track your performance here, right? Again, cost per instance, cost per employee. Are we giving our employees the right access to resources to innovate for the long term, right? Cost per API call, cost per user. But what I encourage customers oftentimes to do is not just think about what those unit cost metrics look like, right? It's helpful for us to think about these metrics in two different categories: those that are driving our costs and those that are driving value for our business, right? So instead of thinking of just a cost per gig, cost per user, cost per ride, cost per host, cost per e-commerce transaction, cost per experiment, those things are going to drive not just our cost line, but our top line as well, right? And by doing that, when we start setting up metrics, both cost-based and value-based metrics, right? If every time our AWS bill fluctuates, we have the rationale right there to help us understand what's going on, right? If our bill goes up, there's one of two things happening. One is that maybe we're falling down on cost efficiencies, right? And that's a call to action for us to either review architectures or look at savings plans or right sizing, right? Undergoing a cost optimization exercise. The second explanation is we're delivering more value, right? We're adding users, we're launching new applications, right? We're doing the things that we would hope to be doing. And by creating metrics that are both cost-based and value-based, it helps us quickly identify what's going on, where can we take action, right? And where should we be celebrating? So I'm not going to go too terribly deep into cost reporting tools, because I know there's a lot of great sessions this week that are going to be diving deep here into cost reporting and allocation. But it's important to talk a little bit about this because it's such a critical part to our planning and forecasting process. And at a high level, you have three choices about how to implement the right tool for your business. The first is Cost Explorer. Again, we've talked a little bit about this, but powerful solution, built-in filters, visualize and track your costs on a monthly or daily level granularity. You can also enable hourly or resource level granularity, right? Powerful tool. Second is you can build your own dashboard. Right? Customers are using services like Customer Intelligence Dashboard, which is a templated dashboard built on top of AWS QuickSight, which allows more customization of those dashboards, custom metrics. Again, similar to forecast, you can marry AWS data with auxiliary data for kind of enhanced reporting and metric tracking. And then third is our partner network. We got a great cloud management tools partner competency, which highlights a lot of great leading partners in this space that have been really successful helping customers manage their cost reporting needs. Okay. So now we've got our reporting tools selected, right? We've got our plan in place. We've got our forecast in place, right? In addition just to monitoring how we're doing, it's critical for us to make sure how we, as an organization, are adhering to those plans, right? And one way to set that guardrail is AWS budgets, right? So I set my plan, I set my forecast, I take those numbers, and I go to budgets and I create a budget for that, right? And AWS budgets will allow us to send alerts to stakeholders across our organization when we're expected to exceed our threshold or when we actually do exceed that threshold, right? And with budget actions, customers can configure specific actions so that when we do hit those thresholds, we have a mechanism in place to respond accordingly, right? So with budget actions, it will take one of three actions, either on an automatic or a manual workflow approval basis, right? The first is IAM actions, where it takes an individual user and changes their permissions from admin to read-only, right? Basically a way to say, hey, Keith, you've already reached your budget for the month. Before we allow you to spend up additional resources, we just kind of want to dig in and make sure this is still a good use case, right? Make sure that we know what's going on. The second is service control policies, where we can do that type of control at the organizational unit level, right? Again, so imagine a scenario where like our developer sandbox has collectively reached their budget for the month, be a way for us to control that spend. And then the third action the budgets can take is to actually stop EC2 or RDS instances, right? Again, these can be done automatically, or they can be done on a manual approval basis, right? So I definitely encourage folks to start small with this and experiment. Start with a manual approach, but it can be a very powerful way to start establishing those automated mechanisms as a company to make sure we're staying on track as much as possible. So with budgets, we just talked about how do we define a threshold where we want to be notified, we want our stakeholders to be notified, right? But what happens when we have a spending surprise that's occurring below that threshold, right? Still unexpected and unanticipated, unplanned for. Is that okay? It doesn't maybe break our budget. Right? The answer is it kind of depends, right? We don't really know, right? And we don't really know because it may be different for specific use cases or applications or companies, right? We kind of got to dig into it. But really, that's the idea behind cost anomaly detection. Cost anomaly detection will provide a contextualized alert based on your historical cost and usage patterns to say, this looks kind of funny, maybe time to go investigate it, right? And what's helpful with cost anomaly detection is it will provide those types of proactive alerts, but it also provides some root cause analysis for us to kind of figure out where we should start looking in our investigation, right? Where we should start our search. So again, two powerful tools that help us start tracking how we're going to keep our actuals as close to forecast as possible. Right, because when we start seeing those two numbers diverge, right, our forecast and our actuals, right, like we need to start thinking about how we're going to handle that. Again, one of the themes here is that this isn't just a service issue. This is an organizational challenge, a process challenge, right? So we need to start defining what that operational plan looks like, right? And I guess one place for us to start here, which is really helpful, is getting a steering committee together, right? Monthly, quarterly, but helping us define what that standard operating procedure looks like and helping us review what the model should look like, what our forecast should be on a recurring basis. So again, that's finance, that's sales, that's marketing, it's product, it's engineering, right? Finance owns budget allocation. Sales has their inputs and their account plans. We have marketing that owns their growth plans. Product has their roadmaps, and they own the the forecast accuracy, right? And kind of going through this process, you start not just identifying, okay, what's our expectation for the future, but how are we going to respond when we start seeing these types of variations? And it's important that this isn't a finger-pointing exercise, right? This is a blameless exercise where we share a goal of getting our forecast as accurate as possible, right? We're starting to identify, okay, when there's a variance, how are we going to react, right? Who conducts the root cause analysis and who gets informed, right? What's the SLA on that? How do I identify when we need to act or when we need to proactively solve issues from recurring in the future, right? And so again, as an organization, once we start getting some of these practices, it's helpful for us to start small, learn, test, start with one product, one application, one team, right? Test, experiment, learn, adjust, and then start including additional teams, right? So with that, I want to bring up Jason Rhodes from Intuit, who's going to talk to us about their experience in planning and forecasting the success that they've had in implementing their own processes. Jason?
All right. Thanks, Keith. Hey, everybody. I'm Jason Rhodes. I'm with Intuit. Hopefully, most of you guys have heard of us. If not, hopefully you've heard of TurboTax, Credit Karma, QuickBooks, MailChimp. These are products that help individuals and small businesses stay on top of their finances. Intuit's got about 15,000 employees. We did about $10 billion in revenue last year. And we got about 100 million customers around the world to sort of give you a sense of our scale. And for the last several years, it's been my pleasure to lead the FinOps function there, at least the development arm of it. So just to take you through our cloud journey real quick here, we started our FinOps program about 7 years ago. We actually had started migrating a little bit before that. We were in our own data centers prior to moving to AWS, and we actually started our program really just after reInvent 2015, and shout out to LV Lee, who I think is back there, who was really the one who got us started. But so the first 4 years of our program was we were forecasting for joint cloud and data center operations. So we fully allocated all of our data center costs, and so as our cloud started to grow, our forecasting meant including both the data center and the cloud components. With the migration completed there in early 2020, we've been pure cloud for the past three or so years. And in that time, we've gotten, we think, pretty good at it. Our accuracy to forecast is generally within 3%, which I hear is a pretty good number. So I'll take you through a little bit how we do that. First thing, real quick, one of the lessons that we learned through the migration was dealing with what we call the double bubble. The phenomenon here is that you can't really move your service or your application to the cloud until you've built up that infrastructure, but you also can't decommission whatever is serving it now, whether that's in the data center or another cloud, until you have something to move to. So there's going to be a period of time where you're dealing with both sort of the old footprint and the new footprint simultaneously. This is something that, again, but after 4 years of doing it, we got pretty good at handling. But for somebody who's maybe just starting their migration, starting their journey, this is something to be aware of. And there's things you can do to try to keep your compute scale as low as possible until you're really sort of flipped over to AWS. But this is something to look out for. And hopefully, ideally, your cloud footprint is less expensive than where you came from before, and you start seeing the ROI before that migration completes. Oh, I clicked the wrong button, sorry. Okay, so this is just to get you started on how we do the forecasting. This is just a really simple sort of calendar that we adhere to. And I think this is helpful because it helps get everybody who's participating in the forecasting cycle in a rhythm. So everybody knows sort of what their due date is, when the cycles begin and end, and things like that. And so for us, it's based around our fiscal year. But your business may be a little bit different. You may have product release cycles that you sort of know in advance, or other events that would influence the schedule that you would use to sort of have available forecasting windows when they have to be sort of locked in and secured for the coming period. But this is the one we go by. And if there's one sort of like core principle that I can try to communicate to you that helps us be successful in achieving that really good adherence to our forecast, it's in this sort of distributed accountability and making sure that the right people are forecasting for the right segments of your cloud. And so it's sort of in this image here, there's our cloud, sliced up into different colors. But the idea is like the entirety of the cloud should be directly accountable to one of the groups inside your organization. There shouldn't be any leftover bucket of dollars that nobody knows who is responsible for that. And everything within that bucket should be clear and understood, and the parties that are sort of driving the cost should be the ones that are paying for it. At Intuit, our company is divided into dozens of business segments, and within each of those segments, there's dozens of development teams. So we have several hundred development teams. Well more than half of our 15,000 employees are engineers that are building and spending money in AWS every day. But generally, a single development team or group will only own 1 to 4 what we call forecast units. You may use the term application or service or product. There's all sorts of different terms that different companies use to describe sort of a purpose-bound collection of cloud resources. So, application works. We've invented a thing we call cloud budget, but generally most development teams aren't responsible for more than 1 to 4 of these things, and that's a pretty manageable number of things for them to keep track of and to have to worry about, come forecast time. One of the things that we've sort of iterated on and learned a fair bit about as we establish these forecast units is sort of the Goldilocks granularity approach. So there's pros and cons to slicing your cloud at sort of different levels of granularity. So if you go with a very fine-grained approach, you have a really high level of traceability. If something's under or over, you're going to know exactly why and where that came from, the development team responsible. But with that, there's a cost of effort in maintaining what would then be a large number of forecasts, and there's less flexibility there. If something is running a little hot, something else is running a little cold, there's no sort of fungibility to sort of average those things together if you're forecasting it too fine a grain. You'll know you're forecasting it too coarse a grain if you've got consistent overages or underages, which where I come from, being under is good, but the finance folks would prefer accuracy over being under. But if you can't tell where that came from, that's an indication that you probably are forecasting and reconciling at too coarse of a grain. So that would be an indication, hey, maybe we need to slice things a little finer, and so we can understand next time this happens, what the root cause of it was and where we need to go to. A lot of the work that myself and my team does to enable this forecast accuracy is it's really about the preparation. So back to everybody understanding sort of what their slice of the cloud looks like and what they're responsible for it's an increasing amount of work in this sort of increasingly multi-tenant and shared technology world that we have today. So anybody who's using Kubernetes or Splunk or that's the icon for Connect. Intuit happens to be sort of a marquee customer of the Connect and related call center services. These are technologies that sort of natively are black boxes where you may have 10 or 20 or 30 different parties using them at once, but in your cost and usage data, you're not going to understand which party is responsible for what fraction of that spend. So a lot of the work that we do goes into sort of understanding the nature and the mechanics of these systems, establishing feeds of additional telemetry data that we can use so that all the different parties that are using and consuming these shared technologies each end up paying the appropriate share of that technology. So that as their consumption of it increases, their costs increase as well. And so if you guys saw the number of variables that Keith was showing around all the things that people have to consider. It's these development managers, I think, are the ones that probably naturally have the most of those sort of in mind. There's things like the optimization drivers they may not be aware of, especially if you're handling things like RIs and savings plans at the center. So with giving them this good insight and helping inform them of things like the optimization drivers, it gives them a fighting chance to get those things right. The other thing, too, around managing the changes, like we were talking about just before there, is there's that forecasting cycle that's established, and one of the, something we're doing constantly is implementing new chargebacks or allocations rules changes so that every group is paying the appropriate share of these different technologies. And that has to be done in concert with the forecast cycle. You can't just sort of change the way that you're distributing cost in the middle of a cycle when everybody's budgets have already been established. So, combining the work that we do with the cycle, this is like sort of a typical cycle that would go through. If somebody says, hey, there's this thing that's grown and it's shared and it's sort of material enough in cost now that we really ought to be allocating and distributing this cost differently. So, we'll look at it. We'll make sure that it sort of meets all of the criteria for a good chargeback, a good allocation. And if it does, then we'll go to work developing that chargeback. And if it's something simple, that maybe just takes a sprint or two. If it's something big like our call center, that actually I think took us a couple months to get done. But the point is that before that change to the way that we handle these shared costs can go into effect, we have to know and understand and have communicated what that's going to do to everybody's forecast. So there may be one group, the one who's been paying that shared cost to date, whose costs are going to go down, right? Because they're not really the ones using it, but the groups who've been consuming that shared service all this time, their costs are going to go up. And so there's sort of a net zero or zero-sum kind of budget transfer that occurs so that the teams, again, that have been paying for it, their budget's going to go down because their costs are going to go down. And then all the groups that have been consuming it, their budget's going to go up to cover their future consumption of that shared service. So this is something that, again, that has to be done. This development work to make that allocation change has to be done in concert with the actual forecast process so that everybody's, has the data that they need to construct that future forecast. Last thing here for me is around steerability. So, a lot of achieving good forecast accuracy isn't really just the forecasting process. I think about it like, if you're swinging a golf club, sort of like the fate of your shot's accuracy is sealed, once it leaves the club face. But with forecasting, your fate isn't necessarily sealed, once your forecast is locked in. The teams that are actually at the wheel of your cloud have steerability. So if things are starting to veer off, whether it's too hot or too cold, it's important to provide them with the insights and capabilities that they're going to need to steer things back on course, right? Which you can't do with your golf ball. So a lot of the technologies that Keith talked about, like budgets and anomaly detection, are really key in helping make that happen. At Intuit, we've developed a suite of capabilities we call Cloud 360 that are sort of aware of all of our custom business rules and logic, but that do a lot of the same things, so that as soon as a team is starting to veer off course, if they're in jeopardy of not adhering to the budget that they've established, we let them know so that they can steer back on track. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it back to Keith to wrap up.
All right, so we're coming up on time here. I know I'm standing between you guys and happy hour, which is a dangerous place to be, so I don't want to be up here any longer than you guys want me to be up here. But there are a couple quick things I want to touch on before we wrap up. And I think for us, one of the things I want to touch on real quick is a forecast without a plan does not a forecast make, right? Consider kind of where you are in your journey as you establish that plan. Think about some of the resources that are available to help make that business plan and set your baseline before jumping into some of the forecasting, right? Consider your forecast not just a service or technology solution, but as Jason was talking about, how you're going to involve all the right people within your organization and design a rhythm of business that's going to work on a continuous basis for reevaluating. And again, a lot of great service here that can help. Cost Explorer, budgets, anomaly detection, help get you started. Got a couple QR codes up here for some great resources. I'll leave this up here for a second, but there's a couple in particular that I think can be really helpful. We have a bunch of AWS Cloud Financial Management resources and a resource guide, the first two. And then the third is our Cloud Financial Management blog, which is a really helpful way to stay up to date with best practices and sharing, customer stories, as well as launch information. So it's a good thing to benchmark or put your bookmark in. And then lastly, there's a lot of great sessions this week in the Cloud Financial Management domain. I could say that. So we have a lot of hands-on exercises for those that really want to kind of roll up your sleeve and get a little bit deeper. We got chalk talks to kind of be interactive and talk through some strategies. And we have more breakout sessions on the way. So lots of great content. Feel free to take a picture and save it. Otherwise, thank you all for being here today. I look forward to talking more. We'll be out in the hall for a few minutes if you guys do have additional questions that we can help answer for you. With that, thanks so much.